Well, good morning, everybody. It's good evening for me on the Oregon coast, and it's good morning for you in the beautiful country of China. My understanding, it's probably about 10 minutes to 9 on Saturday morning there. Hope your people are having a great weekend so far. Welcome to the 8th of these webinar series. I believe it's number 8. And right now we are going to be talking about World War II and how it all started. We've already done a recap on where we've been so far. We looked at the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles, which led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. Not a very nice guy, as we all are starting to find out. His rise to power, the way he rose to power, and why the people of Germany gave him this power. We've also looked at the economy of Germany. We looked at the Great Depression, which caused a big problem in Germany, which led to expedited even his power. His German chancellorship and his dictatorship. Now we get into the mechanics about how the war all started, and most importantly, what was happening in Europe and America during this period of time. So I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share. And here we are. I hope everybody can see it. It should be pretty straightforward. And here we are. So we're going to be looking at World War II. Let's get this thing started. And I'm going to go ahead and move this over just a little bit. Get a little bit more room. Okay. So I hope everybody can see this okay. It's coming through loud and clear on my end. I've got good CPU power output, and I finally got my internet fixed on the Oregon coast here. We are subject to some bad weather sometimes, so they went ahead and they redid a lot of the technology. Okay, World War II. Now, where we were at was we looked at Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. This is when the Jewish people in Germany were rounded up and began to be put in concentration camps. This is when the Jewish synagogues were all burned down and all the Jewish businesses have been ransacked. At this point in time, Hitler was in full and complete absolute authoritative power in Germany. He was a dictator under the guise of fascism and this socialism party, which had all the power in Europe. Or, I'm sorry, in Germany, excuse me. And we were going to look today about the rise of fascism beginning. But what's important to understand is that during this period of time, Hitler had already proven to the world that his economic system worked. As we recall from the last webinar series, they had already put on this World Olympics in 1936. Proving to the world that Germany was not only rebuilt, but it was a superior European power. He put 6 million people to work. As more and more people began to work, they began to rebuild their military very quickly. As you recall, at the end of World War I, the German military was destroyed along with the other militaries in Europe. Their economy was destroyed, and to make things worse, is that the German people and the government were blamed by the other European powers, as evidenced by the Treaty of Versailles, which basically blamed Germany for everything, made them pay for everything, and started to put heavy restrictions on what Germany could and could not do. This is what fueled the rise of Adolf Hitler to a world leader, was the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were terribly unfair to the German people and the German nation itself. So obviously Hitler was rising to power because of the treatment that they had endured with the other European powers. And that is primarily consisting of France, England, and the United States, as well as Italy. So when the Big Four met in Europe after World War I during the Treaty of Versailles era, obviously Germany was not even invited to this treaty signing, and they were made to blame for everything. It blamed everything on Germany. It was a punitive measure of unprecedented unfairness to Germany, and Germany would be obviously in pretty bad shape. To make things matters actually worse, in Germany was we had the Great Depression. When Wall Street crashed and the banking collapsed shortly thereafter, Germany was hit especially hard. So now we've got two different things happening here. One, we've had a country that was decimated by the war and blamed for everything. And now Hitler comes to power and begins to rebuild Germany and put people back to work. And as a result of that, Hitler wanted to become a world dominant leader and country. He was using under the guise of a German so-called, quote, blue-eyed master Aryan race vehicle to do that with, to motivate his people to follow him, which they did, because if they didn't follow him, that would be considered a threat to his regime, and they would be obviously in pretty bad shape. If you didn't adhere to the Nazi philosophy, if you were in Germany in 1938, 1939, you risked some major problems with you personally. So yeah, if people knew what was good for them, they joined the Nazi Party and they supported their objectives. Rises to the rise of fascism, and this is how they did it. If you take a look at this slide, it becomes pretty clear. What fascism actually is a nationalistic political philosophy which is anti-democratic, anti-communist, and anti-liberal. It puts the importance of the nation above all the rights of the individual. The word fascism comes from the Latin word meaning bundle of sticks. These fascists were used in ancient Rome to beat senators who did not vote the way the emperor wanted. So it was pretty clear about what the objectives actually were. Fascist dictators began to take over parts of Europe in the 1920s. This was due to the Great Depression and the World War I, or causing thereof. And this was very, very important. When we think about dictators in Europe, we think of Adolf Hitler, but there were some other ones. Obviously, the one that comes to mind that's probably the most popular would be Benito Mussolini of Italy. Let's take a look at what he was doing. Benito Mussolini became the prime minister of Italy in 1922. He used this position to outlaw all non-fascist political parties and soon became basically a dictator. Not a very nice guy. But again, he used the force of his will and intellect and his vehicle to promote what he was actually doing. The goal of all dictators is power. And don't forget that, class. The goal of all dictatorships have always been power. Power over the country, power over the people. Okay, this leads us to good old Adolf Hitler, who we've been talking about. He became Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Through a variety of manipulative actions, Hitler would soon dismantle the German government and become the dictator. And when you say dismantle the government, what he essentially did is that he eliminated all competition within government where no one would now dare oppose him. Because if you opposed Hitler, the way he manipulated this thing was very simple. If you oppose Hitler, you oppose the Nazi Party. And if you oppose the Nazi Party, you are opposing the greatness of the German nation and its people. Very powerful propaganda was being used to manipulate not only the situation, but to the people themselves. In fact, it got to the point where it was so ridiculous that if you didn't do the old Nazi salute, you were considered an enemy of the people. Therefore, you better do the Nazi salute or they'll put you in a concentration camp or they'll beat you to death in a jail. That's exactly what was happening. So just keep that in mind. In fact, I was hoping, and I hope you people can see the movie that I put on the screen when I first started this webinar. It's called The Rise and the Fall of the Third Reich. It's a fantastic movie. It's a documentary about the rise and fall of Hitler and World War II Germany. It is fantastic. It's called The Third Reich, The Rise and the Fall. Okay. So Hitler becomes powerful. He becomes a leader of Germany. He's rebuilding his military. The people are now following him. They are now the blue-eyed master race. Even young girls who were not married were called Hitler brides, and they were encouraged to have children even though they weren't married. The German nation felt that they needed more people, more Nazis. Therefore, unwed young German girls became pregnant and began to have children, and they were called Hitler's brides. It's absolutely crazy, but it really did happen. Okay, so here we are now in 1936. German moved troops into the Rhineland. This was prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. Do you think Hitler didn't know that? Of course he knew it. He did it in direct defiance of the Treaty of Versailles because he told the German people, as well as the rest of the Europe, you guys treated us horribly after World War I, a war that we didn't start. Therefore, we're going to do whatever we please. And we don't care about your Treaty of Versailles because we were never a part of the negotiation anyway. So he was strong enough at this point, and he had already put on the worldwide Olympics, and people knew very clearly Germany is now back as a superior country in Europe by virtue of its military and its aggressive political philosophies. And this is what was very, very clear. The people in Europe understood about what he was doing. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini signed an alliance creating the Axis powers. They were very smart in how they did this. They got the people to be united and the leaders to be united as well. These were only two of the three countries that were now in the alliance, and they would certainly do another one in 1940 when we get into this. Okay, so you knew what's happening here. In 1936, Germany moves into the Rhineland. They're occupying more territory, but this was actually originally their territory anyway. Hitler was in just complete utter defiance of the treaty itself. Now let's take a look about what was happening in other parts of Europe that would cement Hitler and Germany as the way to go, but people would actually begin to realize that there might be something problem here. The Spanish had a civil war. In 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War would happen, and the fascist forces, aided by Italy and Germany, took over Spain. How about that? And it was just as brutal as ever could be. So now the Spanish were now looking at a fascist government themselves. Okay, now we have more steps toward the war. In March of 1938, now this is something that's very, very, very interesting. Hitler wasn't even a German citizen. Do you realize that? Hitler was actually from the country of Austria. In 1938, Germany annexed Austria. In fact, just literally walked right on in and said, hi, we're going to basically take you over. We're going to annex Austria. And the people of Austria actually celebrated what this was happening. And the reason that they were happy, because they knew they couldn't oppose Hitler militarily or politically. Hitler was an Austrian citizen, and he promised them the same things that he was doing to Germany. Remember, Europe was devastated by the Great Depression. And as a result of that, Austria was hurt like everybody else. When they saw the fantastic economic progress that occurred under Adolf Hitler, the people of Austria actually welcomed Hitler and his armies to come on in and basically help us get the same thing the Germans got, with some other considerations that we will talk about. But in 1938, September, Munich Conference, Hitler forced the British and French to give up or give in to the Sunderland in return for the promise not to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Well, they did it, but guess what? He took Czechoslovakia anyway. And the reason that he took over Czechoslovakia is because he knew he could get away with it, because he definitely had the strongest military in Europe. They didn't want to get into another war with him. And the part of Czechoslovakia that he took over, Germany had claimed that long before World War I happened anyway. Hitler was taking over what he originally had, plus he annexed more of it after he took over parts of Czechoslovakia. He actually threatened Europe with war. If you don't give me Czechoslovakia, I'm going to take it by force. Oh, and by the way, you can't stop me. So Britain and France realized at that point, we have a serious problem. They gave in to appeasement. They said, okay, Hitler, we don't want to start another war. We were devastated by the war. Go ahead and take it. You can have Czechoslovakia. However, Mr. Adolf Hitler, do not go into Poland. Because if you do go into Poland, then that is country that you never had prior to the war. And that means that you are invading a sovereign country. And now we will declare war on you. So they let him have it with the warning that if you do it, you're risking a major world war. Now, keep this in mind. This is very important. All during this time, the United States of America was completely out of the picture. We were having in the midst of a Great Depression. We had a president in this country by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. We were mostly concerned about our economic futures in the United States of America. We understand very clearly what was happening in Europe, but we realized that if we get involved again, we may risk the same problem we had the last time. So we really didn't want to do it. Besides that, Europe should be able to face their own problems. However, because we were in a Great Depression, we started to formulate something that would help Europe. And we began to think about, if this does happen, how can we better the United States while helping in Europe materially without actually getting involved in the fighting? And we will get into that in just a little bit, but it's important to understand the series of events that are going to take place when we start talking about the actual war itself. In March of 1939, Britain and France agreed to protect Poland in case of a German invasion. In August of 1939, and this is very important, the Soviet Non-Aggression Pact with Russia was signed. Basically said that Hitler would not invade Russia, and Russia basically, you can just stay out of the whole picture. They agreed to that. They signed the treaty. Now here's what happened. A month later, Hitler invaded Poland and started World War II. Why did he do it? Because he wanted Poland. And his great plan was to get into Poland, roll across Europe, and then eventually get enough power and enough momentum to where he would actually get into Russia and invade the Ukraine. He did that because he realized that, one, it's resource rich. Two, there wasn't anything that could stop him. That's what he thought. This is the series of events. So now on September 1st, he invaded Poland. And on September 3rd, 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And then Germany and Italy would now declare war on them. Isn't that funny? Because the sad part about it, this whole thing, class, was that after World War I, this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It didn't quite happen that way, because many of the British people realized during the years of the Great Depression that there will be another world war, because the Treaty of Versailles was so lopsided and so poorly executed that there was going to be another war. And it did. Okay. Now, so the European war has now begun, and Europe was absolutely being steamrolled by the Germans. Hitler would invade France, they would invade Belgium, they would invade Norway, they would invade basically all parts of Europe, except for one country. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. Okay. Now, isn't this interesting? We got another country involved in this thing. It's called Japan. Now, Japan was watching all of this thinking, this is kind of cool. There's another war going on. And the Japanese, during this period of time, they had already seized Manchuria. They had seized a lot of eastern China. Now, you people know this. But what's important about what the Japanese were doing is that they were waiting for the cue of Germany to start this thing. They had been communicating for years about the plan of what they were wanting to do. Now, Japan was a very powerful country during this period of time. They had a fully developed Navy. They had some of the best aircraft in the world, and they had a large, aggressive army, and they were in the midst of an industrial revolution in Japan. Japan desperately wanted natural resources. So what did they do? They seized Manchuria. Now I'm sure the class knows this. It's part of your specific history. 1937 to 1940, Japan seized most of eastern China. In 1940, here's where it gets interesting, class. 1940, at the Reichstag in Germany, the Japanese ambassador signed the Tripartite Pact, becoming the third ally of Italy and Germany. Now we have a full Axis power agreements that's saying essentially we're all three together on this. Now let's go out and do what we want to do. When the United States found out about this, and we witnessed the whole thing, Franklin Delano Roosevelt of the United States said basically, the United States is going to be a part of this war. We don't want to be a part of this war, but unfortunately the Japanese, when they signed this, he knew very clearly that the Japanese were going to be an aggressive part of this war, and that the United States would at some point intervene. The interesting thing about it is that the American people didn't want this war, neither did the government, nor did the American people or the government. We didn't want any part of this, but unfortunately we would be thrust into this. But in the midst of all this, the United States was still in a Great Depression. We were hit very hard during this. So how is the United States going to get involved without getting involved? How can we benefit our allies in Europe, our friends, Germany, Italy and England, France and England? How can we benefit these people without materially getting involved in the fighting? Well, the United States of America came up with a plan called the Lend-Lease Plan. And the Lend-Lease Plan and agreement was simply that the United States is going to supply war materials to our friends in Europe to fight against the growing problem of fascism and Hitler. So we were supplying our friends against Hitler. It's called the Lend-Lease. And the reason we did this was because we wanted to help our friends France and England, which would help us financially, but we didn't want to be a part of the fighting. So that's what we did. But during the meantime, though, America started to realize that sooner or later, we're going to get involved in this thing. We started to boycott materials going to Japan because we knew that they were going to be used and turned into war materials fighting against our friends. And that would be primarily China was our ally at this point, and Western Europe was our ally. During this period of time, Germany was exercising its full military capability. They were going into all these places, all these countries, and they were basically destroying everything in their path. They would occupy France. They rolled right into Paris. There's a famous picture of Adolf Hitler right in front of the Eiffel Tower. He had taken France. He had taken all of Western Europe, with the exception of only one country that was never involved in this. And this is the country of Switzerland. Switzerland was never involved in World War I or World War II. And the reason being is that because Switzerland is where the world governments and the world richest people bank. All the rich banks and all the rich financial arrangements are arranged in Switzerland. Interestingly enough, during World War II, the world leading powers, including Germany, Italy, the Americans, all of Europe, would meet in Switzerland during the war and negotiate money for their countries. Interestingly enough, the bankers were all having lunch together, talking about how they're going to finance their country's wars, even though they were being against each other. Isn't this interesting? And that's really what happened. Okay. So as Germany was moving forward, they were exercising their lightning strike capability, which is called well, I'll get into that in just a second, but what's important to understand is that they were unopposed. And their Luftwaffe and their Blitzkrieg were moving across Europe with lightning speed. That's what the Blitzkrieg is all about. It's called a lightning war. Their tanks, their armies were just rolling through Europe, and they were simply being unopposed. They got to the English Channel, and they started to launch the V2 rockets against Britain because of the English Channel was a natural geographical barrier. And they didn't want to get into a naval battle because England was still fairly strong in this area. Hitler thought he could bomb them into submission with the Luftwaffe and the V2 rockets. When this started to happen, America and World War II would get into this really quickly. In fact, during this period of time, when Japan would basically sign the treaty with Europe, the Axis power agreements, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would move the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, to get it closer for a probable fight with the Japanese. Now remember, America initially stayed out of the war, but began a naval buildup just in case, and they did. The disillusionment from World War I and the Great Depression contributed to the popularity in America to stay out of the war. Well, it didn't. In fact, when England was getting bombed with the V2 rockets and the nightly raids, Britain and the beautiful city of London was reduced to rubble. That's when Winston Churchill would fly to America and have secret meetings with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, discussing the plan. How can the U.S. help the people of England and France, because they needed help and they were needed up badly. And Russia was now going to be next on Hitler's little list. But that we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay, the Neutrality Acts in the mid to late 1930s made it impossible for the U.S. to give loans to nations at war or would allow any combatant to buy on credit. FDR had to find another way to help out the British and the French against their fight against fascism. This is where we come up with what we just discussed a little while ago. It was the Lend-Lease Act. And the Lend-Lease Act was simply a way to help our European allies to get into to help them with war materials they're going to need. Now we have what's called the Atlantic Charter. During their meetings, FDR and Winston Churchill met secretly off a ship off Newfoundland to agree on war goals, since both foresaw the U.S. would eventually join this war. They knew it was going to happen. They agreed to ensure the national sovereignty of all nations and drew up the outline of the United Nations that was to come from the Atlantic Charter after the war. I think most countries of the world knew that if the United States was to come into this war, that the Allies would be victorious against Germany and Italy and Japan. And the reason I think that was, and this is very clear, this is some very forward thinking about this. If you take a look at Europe itself, class, take a look at the size of Europe and take a look at the countries itself that are actually fighting in the war. And now take a look at the size of the United States of America. America is a large, developed country with almost unlimited natural resources. It also has a highly educated, highly specialized population with tremendous economic and industrial potential. Once they realized that, they said, you know, if the United States does get involved with this thing, who knows how long this is going to last? At that point, Hitler didn't really want to mess with the United States. They said, you know, I don't really know much about them, but I'm not going to get involved with them because I don't have to at this point. Hitler was focused on Europe, but then Hitler would turn his eyes towards Russia. Now, when we get to this, let's talk a little bit more about America gets closer to war. In the Pacific, things were starting to take an alarming development. In 1941, in mid-1941, the Japanese forces seized French territories in Indochina. This was a clear warning. In response, the United States froze all assets in the US and all trade was cut off with Japan. We embargoed them, like I said before. We cut them off. The Japanese didn't like this, and the Americans began to crack the Japanese secret codes that intercepted messages saying that Japan was planning to seize more islands in the Pacific theater. And they did. So at this point, we were watching them. Now, in October of 1941, General Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan and wanted war with the United States. Hitler said, that's not a good move. We're not ready to have the United States into this thing yet. Don't do it. However, in November of 1941, the US intercepted messages showing that the Japanese force was moving towards Southeast Asia with the intent of taking more land. Franklin Delano Roosevelt demanded that it be recalled and to have Japan withdraw from the conquered territories. And Japan said, no, we're not going to do that. Thank you. So on December 7th, 1941, we just had the 79th anniversary of that just a couple of days ago. The Japanese negotiations agreed to meet with the US diplomats. While they met, the Japanese decided to send the fleet to Pearl Harbor to destroy the Pacific Fleet. We were still hoping for a peace resolution. In 1941, December 7th, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, killing over 2,400 people, wounding 1,200, destroying 300 American aircraft, 18 warships, and 8 out of the 9 US battleships. The United States of America at Pearl Harbor, we got punched in the face, and we got punched hard. Now, what made the United States particularly angry about this attack was that approximately 2 hours after the attack, the Japanese declared war on us after they attacked Pearl Harbor. Interestingly enough, if anybody of you have ever seen a movie called Tora, 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 it's a Japanese movie and a collaboration of Americans that detailed the attack on Pearl Harbor. I urge you to see this movie. It's quite good. Well, needless to say, after Pearl Harbor, what did the United States do? Well, the very next day, through the first and only time in the history of this government, we had a unanimous decision to take action. And that action was to declare war on the Empire of Japan. What they did was totally and absolutely not very nice. Killed a bunch of American people. We never declared war on them. We simply didn't want them to fight. They attacked us with the intent of crippling our military, and they were hoping that we would be afraid not to get involved with them. It didn't quite work that way. The United States did not become afraid. The United States became very angry. In fact, we declared war the very next day by unanimous declaration of the US Congress. Needless to say, because Japan was now part of the Axis agreement, Hitler would now declare war on the United States, and we would then declare war on him. Hitler was very angry at Japan. He was very angry at Mr. Tojo and the emperor, because he said, look, we weren't ready to get the United States involved with this, and now we've got some very serious problems. Hitler would then begin to realize that he's not going to go anywhere with England at this point, because now they've got the help of the United States. He began to turn his focus on Russia. He would attack Russia instead. Well, let's get back to Pearl Harbor, though, because this is very important. We have a war now in the Pacific Theater of Operation. FDR delivered a war message to Congress, and within 3 days, the US was at war with Japan. They agreed to it. Now they're going to formally sign it. And they did. A grim future for the Allies. In January of 1942, the Axis powers had a big advantage in Europe, because remember, they had already had, at this point, almost 3 years head start. Britain was almost defeated. The Axis controlled most of the continental Europe. German troops had captured most of North Africa, and the German subs were trying to keep food and supplies from reaching Britain. Remember, the US joined this thing late, and Germany had its chance to do everything it wanted to do. American and British ships fought to maintain control of the Atlantic to protect Britain from defeat. Allied ships used sonar to locate and attack German subs. This is when it started to get into a full-blown, very, very prolific war. But something else began to happen in America. And this is very, very important, class, because this is the heart of what America was trying and would eventually do. Because now we were in a two-sided war. We were in the war with the Pacific with the Japanese, and now we're also in a war with Europe. How is the United States of America going to win this war? A little different than World War I, because now we've got a completely different theater of operation on the other side of the world, in the Pacific. So how is the United States going to do this, you guys? Well, it's pretty simple. The Americans got together and said, okay, we are going to win this war. We're going to win it because we have the ability to win it. And how are we going to win this war? We're going to start production. Now, the United States was already, as you know, in the midst of a Great Depression, but it was beginning to wind down. Well, when the US government says, hey, calling all able bodies to win both of these wars, the American people responded in unprecedented fashion. We began an operation to where we would build more war materials faster than any other country on the history of the world. And we still hold the record for that. The Americans have one of the best manufacturing and industrial capabilities on Earth, and we would begin to use these manufacturing industrial capabilities to our advantage. Every able-bodied person who could work was put to work immediately. And they had a certain camaraderie. We're not doing this for Europe anymore. We're doing it for America. They hit our base in Hawaii. Now we're into it. And we're going to win this war. And that's exactly what we would do. We would embark on a manufacturing industrialization of America. The world has never seen anything like it since or before it. Now, what's interesting, the day of Pearl Harbor that was attacked, Admiral Yamamoto of the attacking fleet of the Empire of Japan made a very grim and very prolific statement to the Japanese Navy and to his government. He said, even though he supports the Emperor of Japan and he supports the people of Japan, he says, ladies and gentlemen, we've just made a very, very bad mistake. We attacked Pearl Harbor before our declaration of war, which is going to fill the United States with a lot of anger and a lot of resentment. The only thing we did, yes, we destroyed their fleet in Pearl Harbor, we destroyed their aircraft. But what we've really done, people, is that we have awoken a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. And as a result of that, the Japanese people were thinking, well, yeah, maybe we did do that. They were kind of getting like, uh-oh, maybe we did a big mistake here. That would set the stage for what would happen later, because the Japanese military was a very proud and very prolific unit of what they were doing. Okay, capture of a U-boat. This is one little particular, although the subs did a lot of damage. The invention of sonar would help defeat the German Wolfpack submarines. This is a very important development because during the war, we had a lot of technological developments that would help the U.S. win the war. The North African Campaign, 1942, Brigadier General Montgomery wins the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. This starts the retreat of the German General Rommel. In November 1942, American and British troops commanded by Eisenhower landed in Morocco. Now, Eisenhower is a key figure in American history, not only the fact that he was a president, but he was also the Supreme Allied commander in charge of D-Day, which we will get into. Eventually, the two Allied armies would meet, forcing the German surrender in Africa. There are a tremendous amount of battles that you can cover in World War II. I'd like to cover all of them, but I don't think I'm going to have enough time on this webinar. Okay. Take a look at this, the Casablanca Conference. A secret meeting off of Casablanca. FDR would meet Churchill in 1943 in Casablanca. They agreed to win the war in Europe before concentrating on the Pacific. That's what we agreed to do, but we actually would do both simultaneously. But it was clear that Europe was in very serious trouble because the populations were being bombed out of existence. But there was also something else happening in Europe, class. What do you think it was? The reason that they met this is because they were getting intelligence from Europe about something very, very terrible happening in Europe. And this was the Holocaust. The Jewish people were being exterminated systematically in hundreds, if not thousands, of death camps in Central Europe. And they realized that this is an evil beyond comprehension. So when the Holocaust was confirmed by US and British intelligence, they met and they said, oh my God, we got to get this thing done now. We cannot let this thing go in Europe. Little did we know, though, that the Japanese were also committing atrocities in the Pacific theater of operation. And we would soon come to know that. But what we knew at the time was that Germany was committing horrible atrocities in Central Europe. Places like Dachau and places like Auschwitz. These were the nastiest death camps you could ever possibly imagine. People were being incinerated by the thousands. We'll get into that more. Okay, one of the main objectives was to get Italy. American troops commanded by General George Patton, he's a very famous general, by the way, attacked Sicily. 38 days later, Sicily fell and Mussolini was overthrown by a disillusioned Italian population. They realized that if we can't possibly win against the Allied invasion now. Now the United States is involved. We got to stop. Hitler captured Mussolini and set up a fascist state in North Italy, and Italian and German troops continued to fight the Allies in Italy. That would prove to be futile, but it would also prove to be one of the bloodiest wars or bloodiest battles of World War II. Okay. In 1943, Italy surrendered to the Allies and many Italians began to fight against Mussolini and Hitler. This was a big development. In 1943 and 1944, US forces are stalled by Hitler's troops. But finally, in January, Italy landed forces behind the German lines in Anzio, just south of Rome, and they would become victorious. I don't have to tell you, this was some heroic fighting. Battle took 4 months and 72,000 German deaths to win. Soon after the battle, Rome fell to the Allies. And North Italy finally surrendered to the Allies in April of 1944 after 190,000 Americans and 483,000 Germans would die. A movie to see, if you ever seen it, class. In fact, it's an American movie. It's, well, I think it might be available there. It might not. I'll get back into that. I want to see if it's there first before I tell you much about it. Very good movie. And I think that you guys would really enjoy seeing it. It kind of gives you the flavor, but it's more, it's about D-Day. And I will get that to you just to see if it's going to be on this slide or not. I don't think I put it in, but I'll mention it to you before we leave. Okay, the war in the Soviet Union. Now, this is where we get into some really dicey stuff. Germany attacked the Soviet Union with 3.6 million soldiers. This was in June of 1941. This was actually before the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor. The USSR asked the US for the Lend-Lease help, but Franklin Delano Roosevelt refused because he was afraid he was helping a communist nation, and he really wasn't sure what that was really going to be used for. He was concerned about the communism of Russia, and that might prove to be a very costly mistake because after the war, yeah, we were allies with Russia, but things would take a very bad turn after World War II. between the US and Russia. Eventually, the USSR repelled the German attack, but this was only a temporary victory. When in June of 1941, when Hitler would attack the Soviet Union, he didn't realize what he was getting himself into. If you take a look at a map, the Soviet Union is huge compared to the continent of Europe, and cities are way far apart. So if you're going to conquer any population centers, you have to travel by, at this point, unsophisticated, slow transportation that's going to take you days to get to your intended target. Not only that, but he doesn't understand the dynamics of the Soviet Union and that they are an extremely resilient people. But he miscalculated that he didn't give his troops enough ammunition or enough supplies in order to carry out the fight. And this was really, really terrible for the German troops. And because of that, many of the German troops died before they could even get into the fight, coupled with the fact that now Russia was into this thing and was very, very angry because Germany would actually break the treaty that they agreed not to attack. They would not agree, they were agreed to be friends, and Hitler stabbed him in the back. Well, as a result of that, that was Hitler's first grandiose mistake, was that he attacked the Soviet Union. Hitler's second greatest mistake was that he was systematically killing people in his own country that would have fought for Germany. He killed 6 million Jewish people that would have helped him, but instead he killed them because they were Jewish. That was his second grandiose mistake. And the third biggest mistake that he did was he declared war on the United States of America. That would prove to be his basically fatal mistake. Let's get into this. We've got the Battle of Stalingrad, which was absolutely positively the most worst environmental conditions in the history of the world of battle. They attacked the USSR, concentrating attacks on the southern part of the country. The Germans attacked Stalingrad, a major oil and railroad center, but the battle would stall at that point. They would attack these areas, but they didn't realize what was coming. And that was a major counteroffensive by the Russians and the terrible, terrible conditions of Stalingrad, Russia in November of 1942. That was absolutely, in fact, the winter of 42 was one of the coldest winters on record and still stands to this day. Absolutely terrible. By the way, I might as well bring it up to you now. The movie that I was going to tell you about, I'm not sure if you have this or not. It's a good one. Saving Private Ryan. I hope that you're able to see that in your country. It is absolutely one of the best war movies ever done on D-Day and the conditions of what people were fighting for in World War II. It was very, very well done. Called Saving Private Ryan. Okay, the turning point, let's take a look at this. On January 31st, 1943, now it's extremely cold in Stalingrad, 90,000 surviving German troops surrendered to the army at Stalingrad, simply because they ran out of supplies, they were being routed, and now they were freezing to death, starving to death. The turning point of the war in the East. After this, the Soviet Union never lost another battle, and the Germans did not launch any more offensives in the East, simply because they themselves were running out of supplies. Hitler was an absolute fool for doing this to his own people. If he wouldn't have invaded Russia, chances are he would have been able to do most everything else he wanted. But he still had the Americans to contend with because he had declared war. Okay. I'm not going to get into this slide because it's just a detail about how the war was won in Stalingrad. They simply won through numerical superiority. Okay. Now we start to get into the real nasty part of the war. In 1942, the U.S. began its campaign to start bombing the hell out of Germany. And they did. They would bomb Germany with impunity. As the American production started to increase, frequency as well as damage capability was now being affected heavily on Germany. More Americans were now working in the United States producing war materials than any time in history, and we would produce over 300,000 attack aircraft. We were producing hundreds of ships, big ships. We would produce 2 billion rounds of ammunition, jeeps, tanks, bombers, machine guns, hand grenades. Every single thing you could imagine for war was now being produced in Germany, or I'm sorry, in the United States against Germany and the Empire of Japan. It was unbelievable what we were doing. And by 1943, the amount of bombs on Germany would double. By 1944, the US was bombing Germany 24 hours a day. And the reason that we were doing this so intensely is because something else was discovered in Germany that caused great concern with the United States government. Does anybody know what that was? Any teachers here understand what was going on? Because not only did we want to stop the Holocaust, but there was something else that was discovered Germany's working on that caused great distress. And I bet you probably know what I'm talking about, but we're going to get into this next lesson, but I'm going to mention it, is that we came into contact with people and materials that Germany was beginning to work on what they called their heavy water experiments, which lead to the creation of a very crude atomic weapon. Now, I'm going to get into this a little bit on our last session of class, because as you know, World War II, as bad as it was, class, was still not as bad, even though we lost so many people. At that point, we realized that war is terrible and we were going to lose a whole bunch of people, and we did. The Europe and the Pacific Theater of Operations would lose close to 85 million people would die. And as bad as that sounds, it still wasn't as bad as what would come after the war. And that is the development, the implementation, and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Much, much more dangerous. And we knew that we had to stop Germany from developing and acquiring such a weapon that could wipe out entire countries. In fact, we would develop so many nuclear weapons that we could now destroy the entire planet Earth. Something a little bit more serious than World War II. Once we began to realize what they were working on, Germany had already figured out that it could be done. In fact, even Albert Einstein, the famous Albert Einstein physicist, realized, and he wrote a letter to FDR saying, we got a problem and we got to fix this. FDR listened very intently to Albert Einstein because he was regarded as probably, if not probably the smartest guy on planet Earth. So it was very, very clear that we had to do something quick. We have to win this war, which would lead us to D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allied troops commanded by General Eisenhower, who would become our president in the 1950s. By the way, class, I'm going to go on record as saying that Eisenhower was one of this country's very best presidents. And for a lot of reasons, Eisenhower and Franklin Delano Roosevelt were two of our greatest presidents. Truman was pretty good, but he had some problems. Eisenhower was a great president. But anyway, President Eisenhower landed on the beach of Normandy and began the invasion of Western Europe and the liberation of France. And this thing just moved right on through. Between the bombings and the D-Day invasion, America would be victorious. Despite brutal German resistance, 2 million Allied soldiers occupied France. by July, and we would now begin to liberate the whole deal. And the US frees Western Europe. American forces continued to defeat the Germans and freed Paris by August of 1944. In September, Belgium and Holland were freed also from Nazi control. Now I'm going to go one more slide today, folks. I'm going to stop this halfway through because we're almost out of time, but I want to save the next part of this for the next class. The next one we did was the Battle of the Bulge. Actually, there's been some great movies made about World War II. I urge you to see them. I think I've seen them all, and they're all very, very good. But the Battle of the Bulge was a divisive victory. Germany launched its last offensive of the war, attacking in Belgium and Luxembourg. Patton arrived a few days later with 250,000 men. And this was the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and the largest battle of World War II. This was a biggie. The Battle of the Bulge was a decisive battle of World War II in the European theater of operations and would prove to be one of the last major battles that Hitler was in. Well, it was after the Battle of the Bulge, it became a cleanup operation because Germany had suffered huge losses in Russia. They were getting bombed like crazy at nights and during the day. And now the Battle of the Bulge. So it was only a matter of time before the European theater of operation was to be put to rest. Keep something in mind, class. While everything was going on in Europe, there was still a huge battle raging in the Pacific. The Japanese proved to be a very, very tough opponent. They were dug in everywhere. And a place where I used to live in Saipan would be the heart of one of the biggest battles in the Pacific theater of operation. And that's with Operation Forager in the Pacific theater of operation with the recapture of Saipan and the Northern Mariana Islands. And we're going to talk about that next time in the Pacific theater of operations. It's important to understand very clearly that World War II killed over 80 million people died of World War II. It was a transformative event. But what was particularly interesting about World War II is that most historians of the world say, yeah, it was a big event, but it wasn't the biggest event of World War II. And when people look at that, they say, well, what do you mean a transformative event? It means that, did it change the world? Yeah, it did, but it didn't change all of the world. It changed the world in the Pacific. It changed the world in Europe. But what about people who were living in, say, for instance, if you were living in Santiago, Chile, or you were living in somewhere in South America, like Argentina? Did the Battle of World War II really change you? Not really. You knew about it, you heard about it, maybe you had some friends that were there, but the biggest transformative event is what happened that stopped World War II, and that was Trinity. And Trinity, class, is the detonation of 3 atomic bombs. This is why the United States was so insistent that we got to get Germany out of the picture right now, because we know that they're trying to create a bomb, a big, nasty, horrible bomb to destroy entire countries. We have to get this technology. That's why the intensive bombing campaigns happened, and that's why they decided that they have to concentrate on Europe, because of the extermination of the Jews and because of what Germany was trying to do with atomic weapons. What we realized, and what I'm going to say for next time, is Germany and their SS laboratories were way ahead of every country in the world with regard to technology. Germany had developed the first working and perfected jet engine. The Messerschmitt 262 appeared at the end of World War II and was 100 miles an hour faster than anything we could ever even think to produce. They had developed jet engine technology. They developed rocket technology with their V2 rockets. And now they're developing something even more terrible. They were trying to develop the nuclear weapon. It already had the theory behind it, but they didn't have enough time to get it done. We didn't know where they were. Robert Oppenheimer would solve that problem with the Manhattan Project toward the end of World War II, when we would begin to put this all together. We took the German research, we started the Manhattan Project. Robert Oppenheimer and his crew would now develop the first working and perfected atomic bombs. And the atomic bombs class, they were transformative events. In fact, when we blew up Trinity, first one we blew up was in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16th, 1945. That's what changed the world. That's what took the United States and the world in a completely new, different direction, because now we have the capability to destroy the planet. We now have the capability to mass manufacture these things because we did 3 of them. The other 2 atomic bombs were loaded aboard the USS Indianapolis and floated to Tinian, where they would be prepared to drop on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's just a little preview of what we're going to talk about next time. Does anybody have any questions? I think I talked a little bit longer than I should. I hope this was an informative lesson for you. When we get together next time, we will begin on slide number 36. So I appreciate you being here. Let's take a look at some of the questions. Why do Hitler kill innocent people? Because he was not a nice guy. He wanted to control Europe, and he wanted everybody to be part of his fascist Europe. Hitler was not a nice guy. He killed, remember, he killed over 6 million innocent Jewish people simply because they were Jewish. The next question is, so exactly how many countries did they conquer, and how many of them get into World War II? Take a look at Europe, class. The whole continent of Europe was engulfed in this war, with the exception of Switzerland. Now, Portugal and Spain were not really involved, but they kind of were in a way. So I'm going to say they weren't really involved, not in a material sense. But Hitler was eyeballing these countries at one point. The next question we have is, so Hitler killed 6 million Jewish people, and Hitler is just around dragging countries. Let's take a look if I can see the rest of this here. Yeah, who thinks it's kind of stupid? Yeah, well, when you kill, or when you start a war that ends up killing basically 80 million people, yeah, it's pretty bad. In fact, it's real bad. And one has to get into Hitler to find out exactly what was going on that would make him be such a bad person. He wasn't the only person that was bad, class. The other guy, Joseph Stalin of Russia, he would do things and kill 20 million of his own people in Russia after World War II. So yeah, a lot of bad things were going on in the world. Now, why is all this important to you? Because Hitler and all these horrible people that killed all these people, it's important for people to know what happened. And the reason why the Chinese government, the American government, and all these people who care about people these days want students and young people to know the mistakes of what we did, with the hope and the prayer that a war like this will never start again. And this is what is important. The American people never wanted World War I or World War II. We did everything we could to stay out of it. But unfortunately, we were forced into it because we ourselves were attacked. The second thing that's the most misconception is that most people believe that the US is a country that doesn't care about other countries. That's not true. The United States of America has been deeply committed to other countries, and we've tried to help other countries for the last 100 years. We've spent hundreds of billions of dollars trying to help people live a better life. There's nothing wrong with that. And the other misconception about war is that, and why we want you to know about it, is that all wars are avoidable. We don't want the youth of today to make the mistakes of our past. So it's very important you understand that. That's why history is one of the most important subjects you'll ever find and you'll ever learn in school, because we want you to learn this stuff so you don't make the same mistakes your great grandparents did, or your grandpa, or their generation did. And that's what's important about history. Not only that, but knowing about history can help you make decisions for your future. And this is why we want you to know these things, because what we are today is because of what we did then. In fact, I owe you guys a great set of congratulations. Congratulations, you guys, on your government's successful mission to the moon. You guys grabbed a bunch of rocks on the moon and are now heading home. That is really, really neat. That's a neat thing. And the United States is going to get involved in this thing. They're working together on this thing because China and the United States are going to do the same thing that they've got planned to do it on Mars. So that in itself is a great, great accomplishment. And I salute the Chinese government for doing this and putting this together. It's great. What does that mean for you as students? It means an opportunity to get involved in a new industry that could employ hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the future. So that's really, really cool. All right, well, I'm done talking. Does anybody have any questions that want to ask me? IB administration, Miss Annie, do you want to close this off?
Sure. 你们有问题吗？有问题可以举手。Here.
Hi, Linya.
Mr. Courtney.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Is the only way to stop violence to feed more violence to violence? Because that seems like how World War II was ended.
Well, unfortunately, that is the case. Hitler was not going to stop. The Japanese were not going to stop simply by saying, oh, can you please stop? No, that wasn't going to happen. In a situation like that, the United States had to act decisively to win these wars, because it was very, in fact, when we get into the next session, we're going to talk about the Potsdam Declaration and the Yalta Conference, because these declarations, we gave the Japanese the idea, look, you guys, we don't want to do this anymore. We've recaptured all the Pacific Islands. We've captured and liberated all your stuff. We're now bombing your country. We don't want to do this anymore. You've lost. We've destroyed your Navy and your Air Force. Please give it up. We don't want to do this anymore. Save yourself, save your people, and most importantly to you, save your emperor. We don't want to do this. Please stop. And the Japanese prime minister at that time was Prime Minister Suzuki, and he said, no, we're not going to stop. In fact, we're going to kill the Americans with silent contempt. That's exactly what he had said. The records prove it. We even said it again. Please stop doing this. And he said no. That's when President Truman, because President Roosevelt had just died, he said, okay, since they're not going to give up, I'm not going to risk any more American lives. I have to drop the bombs. And he was right. He did drop the bombs to end the war. But looking back on hindsight and what's happened because of the atomic bombs, in his own memoirs, President Truman said he's sorry that he dropped the bombs. Yes, they ended the war. But he said, if I would have had another way to do it, I would have done it. And looking back on hindsight, I would have continued the aerial campaign, and eventually they would have surrendered, but it would have been, could have been more months, many more months before they would have finally surrendered. But dropping the atomic bomb class was absolutely positively the most difficult decision ever faced by any world leader any time in history, because this bombs killed over 250,000 civilians. And it wasn't just a war that would start, you know, like you would kill people. These people would be killed instantly. And many thousands more would die because of the bombs for decades later. So this was a very, very difficult decision faced by an American president who, incidentally, when he became president, didn't even know about the atomic bomb. He had no idea what this was. He was never briefed and never told, because President Roosevelt died suddenly in Warm Springs, Georgia in April of 1945. So how would you like to be President Truman and faced with a decision like this? Not easy, for sure. Okay. Next question. I see here that, okay, killed 6 million Jewish, oh, yeah, okay, we answered that. Does anybody else have any questions? Everybody good? Okay, very good. I think this was a very, very good lesson tonight. I look for the next lesson next week, and that is on the, I guess that would be on the 18th. So thank you very much, class. Shishi, we'll see you next week. Bye.